Hi, this is Kim Parker, and my Social Studies for Literature project is about the Underground Railroad. I chose three books for this unit of study. The first book I chose was a true story from the Underground Railroad called Henry's Freedom Box. This is by author Ellen Levine, and the illustrator is Kadir Nelson. This is a wonderful, wonderful book. It's one of my favorite books. It is a true story about Henry Brown. He grew up as a slave. The book goes in and talks about how he was separated from his family. He was sold by his master to his son, and that he had to leave his family and begin his new life with a new master, and started working into the tobacco factory. It kind of shows a little bit. Here's where he is working in the tobacco factory. It has great illustrations. A lot of the illustrations are using pencil, pen, straight lines, sketches. Of course, it's filled with a great color, but it does have a lot of the lines that we have kind of studied about in children's literature. He ends up, meeting a nice girl, and they end up getting married with permission from both of their masters, and started to have a family. Then, as the story goes, his family, Henry's family, what his wife and children were sold to another master and were taken away from him. And this was his life. And you can kind of see the pain in his eyes through the illustration of how his family was taken away. And so he worked with a man, his name was Dr. Smith, and he came up with a way of how that he could go and escape to his freedom. He went through and was going to be shipped in a box to Pennsylvania. And it shows what he went through to get out of work the day that he left. He had kind of injured his hand so he could report out for work that day and not be in trouble by his master. And then he was sealed up in this box, and Dr. Smith helped him to be mailed to Pennsylvania, where Pennsylvania was one of the states that was a free state for the slaves. It talked about how he made his journey in a brief, he was tumbled around. And it looks like it's on a ship. And then this was a 27-hour trip that he made in this box, and he made it out on the other side and to his freedom. So from that point on, he became known as Henry Box Brown. And then in the back is an author's note. That was a very a great way to describe this book. So if you have a chance, this is a great book about the Underground Railroad to introduce. Another book that I chose to talk about the Underground Railroad was the book called Showay. This book is by Jacqueline Woodson, and it's illustrated by Hudson Talbot. This is a great book that I would especially use to do an activity with the students. But this is also a book about it's a traditional history. I would use this book to talk about the Underground Railroad, because through the history of quilts, that a lady, that author's great-great-grandmother, she would make quilts. With the quilt pattern pieces were codes to direct people to freedom, which I thought was very interesting. And that they would learn the codes of the patches to know that you looked for the star, or that you would look for the Big Dipper. You would go through the curvy path, and those type things. So this book kind of talks about generations and how the traditions were passed down from generation to generation, and how that the the women, they carried on their tradition of sewing, carried on their quilts to show the pattern. This is some of the codes that they would use in their quilts. That the Drunkard's Path, the Log Cabin, Crossroads, Wild Geese Flying, North Star, and these are codes that their masters could not, pretty much didn't know, and they kind of would direct them to their path to freedom. So this was a really good way. This is something that I would use, which also has great illustrations to show. But this is something I would use as an activity that the students, we can talk about the codes and look at some of the codes and then create our own quilt patterns using paper and things like that, and see if we can create our own path to the Underground Railroad or even to another destination that we choose. We could even create our own codes in the classroom and discuss them. But also this book talks about a lot about culture, about traditions of African Americans, and how traditions and beliefs and those things were passed down generation to generation. So this is a great book to talk about culture. The other book, the third book that I chose was a book called Big Jabe. Big Jabe is written by Jardine Nolan. It's also illustrated by Kadir Nilsson, which is the same illustrator as Henry's Freedom Box. This has great illustrations, but I chose this book to talk a lot about culture because a lot of the traditions of the African Americans was passed down as generations by storytelling. That the stories that were told, tall tales. We talk about those things in children's literature, tall tales, and how the stories were passed down and retold. And sometimes they get a little different as they're told from generation to generation. But this book here talks about a slave girl that came across a young boy down in a wicker basket as she was fishing for her master for fish. When her master loved fish, so he would send her down to the river to catch fish. She came across this boy named Big Jabe. He was about 5 or 6 years old, but she was having such a difficult time catching fish. So when Big Jabe asked her what was wrong, and she says, I have to catch fish for my master, he would just bend down to the water and say, fish, fish, come. Where is your fish? Jump to the wagon like Miss Addie Wish. And then he would get, and all the fish would jump up into the wagon, and she would have wagon loads of fish that she would take home. And they would feed the master, and then there was enough fish that they held back to feed the family that night. So then Addie shared with her family what had happened and what Big Jabe did. But then it's soon that all of a sudden it became a plentiful spring. And the spring showed lots of cotton, lots of corn. The chicks hatched by dozens. Everything was just growing and growing and growing in the spring. And as everything else was growing, so was Big Jabe. Big Jabe became very big. He did all of the work of all the slaves, which gave the slaves more free time. And there was just a lot of good story in here talking about how the overseer, Mr. Sorensen, would get very angry because that Big Jabe was doing all the slave work and there was no one for him to oversee, so he would take it out on the slaves. And as he did, natural disaster things would come up, floods, tornadoes, and then some of these slaves would disappear. No one knew where they were. But Miss Addie, the girl that found Big Jabe down by the water, she knew that Big Jabe had something to do with it. And they decided that they figured out that Big Jabe was leading him to freedom. How? They don't know exactly how he did it, but there was a way that he was leading his slave friends to freedom. So this was a good book that talks about storytelling, tall tales, and about slavery too. So these are 3 great books that talk about the Underground Railroad and to introduce to slavery that meets our standard of historical perspective of historical landmarks of the Underground Railroad. Can also talk about geography, about where on the map can the Underground Railroad be placed. Some of the states that where a slave was forbidden, and the states that had slavery. So we could also tie it into geography, and then the other big strand would be it could be tied into culture. We're talking about the African American culture. So if you get a chance, check out these books, and they make great reads for your classroom. Thanks.